Okay, we're going to get started with our PowerPoint for the week. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Here we are. Okay. So what I want to talk about today is a little bit about how IDEIA fits in with 504 with ADA and kind of that framework that we're looking at. In the book, it talks a lot about students with exceptionalities, and what we're talking about with exceptional students is not just students in special education, but students at both ends of the spectrum. And I want to go through and explain to you how that students who are found eligible for special education are also protected by 504 and also the American Disabilities Act. So this just gives you a framework of how they all sit together. So you can see that if you are IDEIA eligible, you are also within that 504, within that ADA, within all students. So the American Disabilities Act was enacted in 1990, so it's a relatively new legislation. And essentially what ADA says is that we have to have accommodations for all Americans who have any sort of disability. And this really protects, this doesn't just protect students, this protects people. It protects people in places like the workplace. It helps make sure that buildings are accessible, that pools are accessible, that our grocery stores have a way for everyone to get in. Everything is wheelchair accessible. It also makes sure that businesses can't discriminate against employees. So the American Disabilities Act really protects everyone who has a disability, regardless of whether or not they're found eligible for special education in an educational setting. So ADA goes beyond schools and really looks at all the environments that a person might come into contact with, far-reaching beyond school. So the Section 504 is a school-related initiative. So what 504 says is that you may not qualify for special education services. So you may not qualify under IDEIA. However, you still may need some sort of accommodations in order to benefit from school. So this prevents discriminations of students. So whereas ADA prevents discrimination of all people in the workplace, in stores, it makes things accessible, Section 504 is a school-related initiative. Okay, so in order to be eligible for 504, you have to have some sort of disability that's limiting your life activity, and it can go beyond those categories that we qualify students for in special education. So it has a kind of a broader definition. So this is for students who may have some sort of short-term thing going on, some short-term disability, or perhaps it's long-term, but there isn't an educational impact. So an example of someone who might qualify for 504 might be someone who maybe is undergoing cancer treatment and needs specialized services. Or perhaps they have CP and they need additional supports, but they don't really qualify for special education services because there isn't an educational impact. So 504 helps those students who have something else going on, medically or otherwise, but can still access the curriculum without additional supports. They're doing okay. The difference in funding, if a student qualifies for IDEIA, the school and the county receives funding. For Section 504, there is no funding attached. 504s kind of fall back to a general ed teacher, sometimes a school counselor, whereas special education under IDEIA falls under special educators. So it's a very different process. So when we talk about IDEA, the very initial provisions, there's a number of components that are included within IDEA. One is identification, and that's when we get under the 13 major categories for identification, and we'll go through some more of these further. We're going to go through FAPE a little bit more, those with an asterisk. Due process, which is essentially making sure that each family has the same rights to services and goes through the same process the same way. So it's a very standardized format, going through the process of evaluation, signing off on evaluation, making sure that parents have rights, making sure that all the pieces of information are examined. It's a very formal process, and that's the due process component. The parent-guardian surrogate consultation, so making sure that parents are well informed, that we have all of our parent rights translated for parents who need it, and essentially making sure also that if there isn't a parent who can attend, that there is someone who will stand in as the guardian to sign off on a student's IEP or individual education plan. Least restrictive environment, the individualized education plan. We'll talk about non-discriminatory education, which ties in with the cultural competency components that we're also talking about within this week. Confidentiality. The confidentiality is across the board with all students and student records, but that was also part of IDEA. And professional development and in-service, which was targeted towards teachers. And that's where we started talking about how we make sure that our teachers are providing the services needed for students who fall under this category. If you take a look at PL 94, 142, IDEA, IDEIA, you can see kind of the progression of what's changed over the years. So these are reauthorizations that have occurred. The initial law was passed in 1975, and the most recent reauthorization is 2004. We are way, way overdue for a new reauthorization. It hasn't happened, and I am not sure when it's going to happen. But we are definitely due for a reauthorization, so we're all just kind of waiting. One of the things that you'll notice over the years is that the transition plans for students kind of flip-flopped back and forth. They were introduced in 1990, so when students turned 16, there were transition plans that were written into a student's IEP. So this is helping them get through the post-secondary process or planning for post-secondary. And then in 97, it went down to 14, and then they realized that was still too early, so they went back to 16 at 2004. Some other bigger changes. In 1990, we added autism and TBI as disability categories, traumatic brain injury. That was the first time that we had those two categories. And some other changes that were written in is in 2004, some big things is that IDEIA was reauthorized to align with No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind is not a special ed initiative, and what happened is once No Child Left Behind was passed, there were a lot of components that were contradictory to what IDEA says. So we had to go back and kind of revamp things so that the two aligned. The other important pieces were a lot on response to intervention, as well as moving away from a discrepancy requirement for learning disabilities. So instead of saying, okay, well, your IQ is 120, but your achievement's only at 100, let's just subtract, and based on this score, either you qualified or you didn't. We started saying, no, let's take a look at how interventions are impacting the student. And so that's where that response to intervention piece came in. Let's document how the student is responding to interventions, and if they're responding to interventions, then let's talk about disability. Let's stop using this mathematical formula to, determine whether or not a student has a learning disability and kind of do this overarching sweep of disabilities. So it did break it down, which has been really good, I think, for a lot of students. And it's also created a situation where we have to implement interventions. We have to try things first. So we're not just going to the table right off the bat and saying, oh yes, the student has a disability. When we look at assessment of students, IDEA requires multidisciplinary evaluations. So you're going to have a school psychologist, a school social worker, a diagnostician. All those people are going to be using tests that have been found to be both reliable and valid, and they have to be implemented in the student's native language. So we cannot use a single measure. We have to look at the big picture, and it's really important to understand that all of these components, the IQ test, the social history, the interventions that have been documented in the classroom, the achievement test, are taken as a big picture and not just kind of sifting through one component at a time and making judgments that way. In addition, when we're looking at identification, we have to figure out how the student themselves are functioning, as well as how they look compared to other students their age. So some of the things that we look at are the inter-individual differences. So in other words, where does this student rank compared to all other third graders? We need to know that. We need to know how we are benchmarking students. I need to know if my third grader is performing at the same level as other third graders. So that's one component. Another component, though, is the individual differences. So do I have a child who may be doing okay compared to other third graders, but is their verbal reasoning off the charts, exceptional, but their auditory reasoning or their auditory processing is well below average? That also tells us something, that there's a huge gap, a huge discrepancy in how that student's learning, which gives us an indication that there's a problem, and there's probably a processing problem that's going on. So we have to take both of these components into consideration when we're figuring out eligibility and when we're starting to work on that IEP. Going through the referral process, all students by law are required to go through a pre-referral process. In that pre-referral process, if a parent requests that a child be evaluated, typically the team should backtrack a little bit just to make sure that there are some interventions that have been put in place. But once you get to the referral process, once someone says, we need to refer this child for special education, we need to see what's going on, the child is formally assessed. And that's when all of your legislation, all of your regulations kick in. Once that referral is set into motion, a parent does have to sign off. The parent has to sign off on the specifics of what's going to be tested, and that's when the county then goes under a timeline to get everything done. So it's not just a quick and easy, we're going to sign off and get this finished. It has to go through the proper channels. And then once we go through the assessment process, again, that's when we're making sure that we have the parent's permission and we're using that multidisciplinary approach. So let's see if we can get this referral process video to kick in.
Hello, my name is Leah McLaughlin. I'm the principal at Southern Elementary. This project was completed by Carrie Boyd, Kirsten Whitehouse, and myself as a requirement for the special ed law class at the University of Kentucky. If you have a child that is going through the special education referral process, you will find this presentation very informative. You may have several questions at the beginning of this process, including how your child was identified for the special ed referral. There are 3 ways that this could have happened. The first way is through child find, which the state of Kentucky must identify and locate and evaluate all children with suspected disabilities in the state or who can qualify for special ed services. Another way that this could have happened is through a referral done at the school level. A school professional may ask that a child be evaluated to see if he or she has a disability. Parental consent is needed before this child can be evaluated. And the last way that the referral process can start is a request by parents. You could have easily made contact with the child's teacher or other professionals at school to ask if your child could be evaluated. Now that we've identified that your child has a possible learning disability or disability at all and could need special education services, we move on to the evaluation process. Before we can do the evaluation process, we have to obtain parental consent. That is your permission, giving us the chance to assess your child in all of the areas related to the suspected disability. Once the evaluation is conducted, the results will be used to decide if eligibility pertains to your child. If you agree with our evaluation, we'll go forward with the process. If you disagree with the evaluation, you have the right to take your child for an independent evaluation, and you can even ask that the school system pay for that evaluation. Now that we've evaluated, the results will be determined, will help us determine whether or not your child is eligible for special services. If they are not eligible, this is where the process ends for you. If we do decide that your child is eligible, you have the right to disagree with the decision, and you can ask for a hearing that challenges the eligibility decision.
So that gives you just a small, brief of what it looks like. I'll post the entire link on Canvas so that you can see how that all works. So the discrepancy model of assessment, I mentioned this earlier, that we no longer go through this discrepancy model where we were literally taking the IQ score and then subtracting the achievement scores, something that you would get on a Woodcock-Johnson test or something similar that was an achievement test. And if a student was within a certain range, they qualified as being learning disabled. We've moved away from that. So instead of just doing the discrepancy model, we look at the variety of assessments. In the state of Virginia, it's still county by county for the most part. I can tell you for certainty that Fauquier County, Prince William County, and Fairfax County no longer use a discrepancy model. I'm not sure about Stafford, Spotsylvania, and Fredericksburg, but I can check on that. But the discrepancy formulas used to be about 15, they would range between 15 and 20 points. So if there was a difference between IQ and achievement, and that difference was anywhere between 15 points to 20, then a student was found learning disabled. It didn't matter if any interventions were done. It didn't matter what the other assessments said. It was strictly a math formula. So we've definitely moved away from that, and I think you could see the benefits of moving away from something like that. So the response to intervention, which was enacted in 2004 through IDEIA, goes along with this movement away from the discrepancy model. So RTI is a process that uses instructional interventions based on tiers. So if students are getting or making strides with achievement based on the tier that they are currently in, then we increase the interventions. But the point of the process is to make sure that the students have ample support, ample individualized support before we move to the special education level. So the next slide is going to show you some of what that looks like. So if you look at an RTI model, you'll see that there's a first, second, and third tier of intervention. The primary instruction, that very first tier, that's the instruction that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. This is doing, making database decision making. You're using formative and summative assessments to gauge where your students are progressing. We have high quality instruction, and within an RTI framework, we're doing something called universal screening. And what universal screening is it is a way to look at the entire school and see where the entire school is functioning. So I may do a universal screening on reading fluency. So once every quarter, I may, do a 1-minute probe with every single student in the school to see where they are with fluency. Once I take all that data, and if I put it into a spreadsheet and essentially rank the students, I can see kind of where they fall in these tiers. I can see who is meeting the benchmark for that grade level. I can see who is kind of teetering and who really is, far behind. So database decision making, the universal screening goes together. Progress monitoring has to do with looking at those students who are not making progress and doing those probes, doing those checks with them more frequently. So if they're in that secondary intervention, we see from the classroom, we see they are not making progress. We may go in and do a secondary intervention. We start pulling some small groups. We add another reading intervention, so we're working on the fluency more intensely. And what we'll do is we'll progress monitor more frequently. So if you're in that primary instruction piece down here at the bottom, you may only get progress monitored, I don't know, once a quarter. Once you go to the secondary intervention and you're getting small group, we may start progress monitoring you every 2 weeks or once a week. So you'll see it become more frequent. So let's say you're getting the secondary intervention and you're still not responding. That's when we start looking at this third tier. And that's when we start getting really intensive. Within this range, this third tier, we are looking at progress monitoring probably on a weekly basis. That would be very common. Oftentimes, folks who are on that third tier are already in special education or receiving some sort of services. Those also may be our students who are English language learners and receiving additional services. So when you're talking about the essential components of RTI, you're talking about universal screening, which means we're looking at the entire building. We're talking about high quality instruction. We can't say that a student needs more intensive instruction if they're not getting the very basics in the classroom. It's focused on interventions, progress monitoring, making sure that we're frequently collecting data on students to see if they're responding to interventions, and then we're making decisions based on data. The point about fidelity is goes back to the interventions. If we're not implementing interventions the way that they're supposed to be implemented, then we don't have fidelity measures. If we're not progress monitoring, in other words, doing those probes, doing those check-ins with students the same way every single time, then we don't have fidelity. So that's where the fidelity piece comes into play. Now, if a student is not responsive to individualized interventions, they're in the Gen Ed program, we're offering RTI, and they end up going through the eligibility process. If they end up in the eligibility process, there are 13 federal categories of disabilities. This is where we currently are at this point with categories of disabilities. I wouldn't be surprised to see some of these start breaking out a little bit more, particularly the autism and autism spectrum disorder. Right now, it's all lumped into one. So if you have a student who has Asperger's or severe autism, it's all the same category. And that's not a real good indication of where a student's functioning, because autism is a spectrum disorder and we have such variation. So you will see these 13 categories. And in the book, it does detail each of these, and we'll refer to these frequently throughout the semester. When you look at delivery options, once a student is found eligible, we start talking about least restrictive environment. And the least restrictive environment, it usually starts at the general education classroom because it is about access. However, least restrictive environment should be individualized based on the student. Where is the student going to be able to access the curriculum to the greatest extent possible? As we move into more restrictive environments, we are adding additional supports, we're adding additional personnel, and so it's really important to make sure we know where the student can maximize their potential without being away from their general education peers. And so if you take a look at this framework, it shows you the view of delivery options. So you can see the regular classroom at the bottom and all the way to the top with hospital and treatment centers, homebound instruction, residential schools. So the more you move up, the more you have intensity of instruction, the fewer children you have in those placements. But the disabilities are also more severe as you move up, and the less these children are with their same age peers. You're moving away from being integrated within the schools. So you'll see that you only move to the next step when absolutely necessary, and you don't take leaps. We're not going to go from a regular classroom with resource all the way to a residential school. It's a continuum. We'll move through the process. Okay. When we're talking about just the entire special education process and monitoring and reviewing, you have to make sure that there's a set of procedures in place that help resolve disagreements between schools and parents. So due process is part of that, as well as mediation. So both the school and the parents are entitled to protection. And so if a school disagrees with a parent's decision to pull their student out of special ed or to not sign a document, they can go through and ask for mediation, but so can the parent. And it's really important to know that it's a two-way street. IDEA says that mediation can be provided to parents at no cost. So if the mediation isn't successful, then decisions can be appealed, and this can keep going. This is why we have federal cases and why we have regulations that we do, because somewhere along the way there's been a disagreement, it's gone through mediation, there's been appeals, and it has snowballed to a national level. And you will see some of that within the court cases that have set precedents for how we go about working with our students in special education. We are required annually to review students' progress and to check the IEP. So we need to make sure that a student has, we have to make sure that a student has all of their needs met in the IEP and is making progress towards the goals. Every 3 years, IDEA says that we need to go back and look at the existing data to make sure that a student still qualifies. It doesn't require you to have new assessments, but typically you do. I mean, the difference between a first grader and a fourth grader is huge, as well as between a fourth grader and a seventh grader. So we want to go back. Assessments help us understand what's going on with the student and to see where the strengths and weaknesses are. If everyone agrees that the student is still eligible for services, the team doesn't have to assess. And in those cases, you're primarily looking at students with very severe disabilities, students who are pretty profoundly disabled, and you may not even be able to get an accurate IQ. So it really doesn't help the team to go through and try to go through the battery of tests, because nothing has changed with the student, especially if they have a pretty severe medical condition that's impacting their education. Parents have to be informed, and so the parents go through that process just like they did initially. Other times that there are reviews other than yearly and during the 3-year, if there's no progress noted on an IEP. So let's say I have a student who has an IEP, it's been 4, 5, 6 months, and we're not seeing progress, maybe we're seeing a slide back. Both the parent and the school or the school can request a meeting to review that IEP and make sure that the goals are appropriate, make sure the data collection is happening, and to figure out if the interventions are on track. IDEA says that parents with disabilities have a right to progress reports as often as other parents. So just like you get report cards every 9 weeks, parents should also be getting a report on the student's IEP. So they should be getting progress updates as well. So there's a lot more communication, very formalized communication that happens. In some school systems, they do offer them at interim time as well. So if a student gets an interim, there should also be an IEP progress report attached that relates to the goals. So this is an overview about the special ed process. I put some other things up on Canvas so that you can see kind of a diagram of the process, and the readings are pretty helpful in understanding that process. I want to switch gears for a second and start talking a little bit about multicultural and bilingual aspects of education, because this does become a gray area when we're talking about interventions and students who are struggling with the English language, and oftentimes it may present itself as a disability when in all actuality it has to do with language barriers. The research will tell us that there is an over and underrepresentation of some students within special ed programs. And when we're talking about overrepresentation, what we're saying is we're talking about a proportional number. So if I have 3 students out of 10 who are English language learners, then I should also see 3 students out of 10 who may qualify for special education. And overrepresentation would mean that I have double that number or triple that number. It's not proportional to the population. Whereas underrepresentation is the exact opposite, obviously. If I have 3 students out of 10 who are English language learners, I should see 3 of them in the gifted program as opposed to just 1. So when you're seeing over and underrepresentation, I want you to think about it as a proportional equation, proportional to the population of those students. And here's what we know, that typically there is an overrepresentation of minority students in special education. And this is particularly true for certain disability areas as well. We tend to see an overpopulation of Hispanic males labeled with an emotional disabilities label. We see an overrepresentation of Black males within the intellectual disabilities category. We also see an underrepresentation of minorities in gifted and talented programs. And this also goes into gender and all sorts of socioeconomic things as well. But just know that when we're talking about minority students, we're talking about language and we're talking about culture, we do see under and over representations of these students in our exceptionality categories. Some of the things that come into play, there's so much research on this, and there is no one answer, but some of the causes have been pointed. Some of the causes are the socioeconomic status, having accessibility to resources, parents having the accessibility to resources, the internet, to books, having books in the home, that sort of thing. The identification of procedures that are by professionals that are culturally dominant backgrounds. So having teachers who don't have an understanding of different cultures, understanding how cultures interact socially. If we're talking about Hispanic males, where they stand in the family structure in their own homes, and then how that conveys to a school setting and with the adults that they work with. Some of the instructional methodologies we use are culturally dominant, which is typically whatever the popular culture is or the overarching culture is of the society. And again, the teacher's perceptions of diverse students, learners' needs. So really having an understanding of the needs of students who may have some language barriers or may have some cultural barriers and not understanding how to meet those needs. So because of disproportionality, we end up with a less effective educational experiences. And unfortunately, with these particular students, we also see an increased rate of dropout and underachievement. So it's a snowball effect. And so we see these students also not finishing school or not finishing with the standard diplomas or the higher diplomas that they could possibly achieve. So some of the classroom assessments is to, when we're looking at making sure that students qualify for any of our exceptionality, whether it's gifted or special education, to make sure that we're administering assessments to them both in English and in their native language. And if the student doesn't demonstrate a disability in their native language, it's clearly not a disability, it's a language barrier issue. So we need to address it at that point. And that's why schools should be using multiple assessments, because we can't just rely on one assessment. We also have to think about the tools that we're using. You know, I remember teaching one year, and I did this whole reading comprehension lesson on this story about a groundhog. And we were going through, and they were talking about the groundhogs, and they were going to do a reading assessment activity at the end. And I had been going on for days. And we get to the end, and I said, okay, so now what we're going to do is take this information, and we're going to use it to create our own story about a groundhog who's doing X, Y, and Z. And I had a student raise his hand, and he said, I don't understand what a groundhog is. And I said, well, what do you mean? We've been talking about it for 3 days. He says, well, I don't know that I've ever seen a groundhog. And it occurred to me at that point that this particular student had only been in the country for a few years, had limited experiences even outside of his own neighborhood, and had absolutely zero idea whether or not I was talking about an animal that looked like a bear or looked like a mouse. And so I had to backtrack because I had not explained to this student, shown pictures, or made connections to something that that student already knew because he wasn't aware of what a groundhog even was. So making sure that we're using assessments that students even are aware of and have knowledge about. And then, of course, looking at the bilingual education, if at all possible, or at least an interpreter. Okay. So some of the suggestions as a teacher, looking at the sensitivity of cultural heritage, instructional and materials that respect different learning environments. And I'm going to click on one of these videos now, but then I'll put the other link up on Blackboard for you. But I think it's really important to become culturally competent teachers, to understand who you are, what your culture is, and how that bias or lens changes how you see other students and how you work with them and make sure that they can be successful as well. So I'm going to show you this one.
I think that culturally competent teachers think of their students as a group of people from whom they can learn. One of my colleagues at the Northwestern University, Carol Lee, talks about a classroom in which she was studying teachers, and the teacher that she was working with would always say, you have to study the students. And that's what culturally competent teachers do. They don't presume that just because a student is of a particular race or ethnicity, that they already know what that student is like. Even if that race or ethnicity is exactly the same as theirs, they literally study the student. And because every group of students is a new group. One of the mysteries, how do we start to think about kids' potential? The 11th grader who walks in with the hat on backwards and the looks like the next rapper, or the 5th grader who comes in threadbare and poor. How do we think about their potential? Who do we think these youngsters are going to be? It turns out most of us are pretty poor judges of that. So a culturally competent teacher knows there's no point in making an assumption. I always say to my own students, do you actually think that Martin Luther King's 4th grade teacher said, oh my goodness, Martin Luther King Jr. is here? She probably said, this is Reverend King's son. I guess I have to work with him, but, these preachers' kids are maybe a pain in the neck. That's a very human response to have. But it was Martin Luther King. But you can't know. So you don't know where the next cure for cancer is coming from. You don't know where Bill Gates is sitting. You have no idea where Toni Morrison is. You don't have any clue that Cesar Chavez is sitting there ready to, at some point in his life, lead farm workers. So you have to teach as if they're in that classroom. They're there somewhere. That's what you see among culturally competent teachers, this pushing and stretching of kids because they have no way of knowing, where the next genius resides. One of the teachers in my study had a wonderful sign outside her door, and it said, quiet, geniuses at work. So she had this visible symbol that she shared with the school community, but with her own students about who she thought they were. She was constantly telling them how smart they were. Even when they were struggling, she would say, okay, but you're smart. The other thing that you often see among culturally competent teachers is their understanding that there's probably more expertise distributed in the classroom than there is within any one person. So much of their work is work that helps kids collaborate and become more interdependent to work with each other.
Okay. If you ever want to see more incredible stuff, you can always check. I'll put the other link up there for you as well. Okay. So I hope that you'll take a look at the readings. There's also a fabulous article that I put up, a research article about special education and the language barriers, which is really interesting. So take a look at that and make sure that you finish up all of the different readings that are listed up on Blackboard. When you take a look at what's going on. Make sure this coming week you set up your practical assignment and you post your plans on the discussion board. If you want to ask me first, please do. But get that up there so that I know that you're thinking about it, you're starting that process, and you're getting that underway. I don't want that to kind of wait until the end and then you're scrambling to get that done. You have a quiz up already for their first quiz. And then next week you'll select a case for the case law presentation and you'll sign up in the collaboration section. So you'll decide which of the case law proposals you want to do. We talked a little bit about some of the law today. There is plenty of cases out there. Next week, with your partner, you'll also select a disability for a research project. If you don't have a partner and you want me to assign one to you, please let me know. You also have some prompts on the discussion board next week, and then in 2 weeks, you'll have a quiz. As always, please let me know if you have any questions. I will be more than happy to answer them. Come by and see me in my office. I would love to meet you. I'm also going to put up a Q&A. When people send me questions, I'm going to take their questions and list them out and then put the answers so that if anyone else has a similar question, you'll be able to find it. I'm going to publicize who asked me the question, so don't not ask me a question because you're worried it's going to end up in front of everyone. So I hope to meet some of you soon, and I will see you all next week. Take care.